a place you do not know. Lehi.
So the name of my book is A Passion for Israel, Adventures of a Sar-El Volunteer, and it tells the story of my journey that led me to start volunteering on Israeli military bases. It also describes a volunteer opportunity available to anyone who'd like to strengthen their connection to Israel.
I can do the screen.
So my story starts out in a very unusual way, an unusual place, although I didn't realize it at the time growing up there. I grew up in the closest thing to a moshav in North America. And for those people who are not familiar with the term moshav, it's a close cousin of a kibbutz. It's a collective agricultural community. My moshav was located on the outskirts of a small town that you've probably all heard of because you're in the Philadelphia viewing area, called Vineland, New Jersey. And my moshav was established in the 1880s by the same European Jewish philanthropist who was establishing kibbutzim in Israel in the 1880s. Not surprisingly, on my moshav, almost all the Jews were farmers. And on my moshav, at least in growing up, all the Jews my parents' age were Holocaust survivors. Everyone I knew of my parents' age had a number on their arm from the concentration camps they'd been in. Except my father. My father had survived the Holocaust in Poland, not in a concentration camp, but as a member of a large and successful Jewish fighting force operating in the forests of eastern Poland. My dad's unit did great damage to the German military, but also saved a lot of Jews. He wrote a book about it called Fighting Back. So I grew up in a very Zionistic environment. Why? Not because people talked about the Holocaust, just the opposite. The rule amongst my parents' generation was, don't scare the children with dark stories. So they didn't talk about it at all. But they did talk a lot about Israel. Because my parents' generation felt, and I agree as well, that had Israel existed in 1939 before World War II broke out, there would have been no Holocaust. And my parents believed, and I believe very strongly, that it's the existence of the state of Israel which prevents another Holocaust or mass persecution of Jews. Think about it. It's been 72 years since the establishment of the state of Israel. And in that 72-year span, there's not been a single mass persecution of Jews anywhere in the world. Now, you might think that's normal, but unfortunately, sad to say, that's not normal in the history of the Jewish people. Because if you go back before World War II, you'd be hard-pressed to find any 72-year span where there wasn't some mass persecution going on against the Jews somewhere in the world. And there's been none since the establishment of the State of Israel. And that's not a mere coincidence. And if you ask a high-ranking Israeli officer in the IDF, not just any soldier, but a high-ranking officer, what is the mission of the IDF? The first answer he or she will give you would be to defend the country, to defend Israel. And the second answer they'll give you would be to defend Jews around the world. So, if it's the existence of the state of Israel that prevents another Holocaust or mass persecution of Jews, and if Israel defends Jews around the world, including me and my family, then in growing up, I asked myself, what can I do to defend or strengthen Israel? So in growing up and becoming an adult, I joined various pro-Israel organizations. You know the names, organizations like AIPAC, Jewish National Fund, KKL, Friends of the IDF, and others, and I supported them financially. And at a certain point, simply writing another check to a worthy pro-Israel cause, although a good thing to do, just didn't seem like enough for me, didn't satisfy me. I wanted to do something more, and I wanted it to be more personal than simply writing a check. Then I came across a program called Volunteers for Israel, or Sar-El. It places civilian volunteers to work on Israeli military bases. So I thought I'd give it a try. And I remember on the flight over to Israel, thinking to myself, I must be crazy. I don't have any military background. I don't even speak Hebrew, except maybe this much. But when I got there, I discovered I was not alone. There were lots of other people just like me. Every year, about 4,000 people volunteer for this program, both men and women, both Jews and non-Jews, from many countries of the world. And over the history of the program, over 150,000 people have volunteered for the program. So I tried it that year, and I really liked it. So I came back a year later and tried it again, and I loved it. And I got hooked on volunteering. So for each of the past 18 years, I've volunteered on an Israeli military base. It's a wonderful experience because you feel like you're making a personal contribution to the state of Israel. Now, this experience definitely takes you out of your comfort zone. You live in the barracks with the soldiers, you eat in the mess hall with the soldiers, and you work side by side with them. And of course, You wear Israeli army fatigues. You're not actually in the Israeli army, but you're required to wear Israeli army fatigues to work on base. The work that we do is work which, if we didn't do it, a soldier would have to do it. So it's meaningful and it's necessary work. Now, people might ask, well, would they really put you civilians to any kind of serious work on an Israeli military base? What kind of work do they give you? The answer is, it's not sexy work. It's logistics work. We pack things. We pack medical supplies. We pack combat gear. We repair communications equipment. We do base maintenance. We do whatever they ask us to do. Now, the volunteers bring two important benefits to the IDF. The first is obviously the work that we do. And to the extent that we volunteer, each of us replaces an Israeli soldier for more frees them up basically for more serious duties, such as guarding the borders of Israel or patrolling the streets against terrorism, or simply calling up fewer reservists in the Israeli reserves. So that work that we do is an important benefit. The second benefit we bring to Israel is even more important. And that benefit is the morale boost it brings to the Israeli soldiers to see volunteers come from around the world to support them and their country. That morale boost is tremendous. And so I'd like to share with you a story from my book that illustrates that morale boost. Back in 2006, I was assigned to a paratrooper reservist base near Rehovot, Israel. And I arrived on that base just at the very end of the Second Lebanon War. So soldiers were coming off the fighting front in Lebanon, back to this base to drop off their equipment, spend a day or two to rest, and then go home. And it happened that the first night I was there, I had dinner in the mess hall, sitting with a platoon of paratroopers who had just come out of 3 weeks of intensive fighting in the Lebanese mountains. These soldiers were tired. They were more than tired. They were exhausted. You could tell how exhausted they were by how they sat at the table, slumped over their food plates, barely eating, not talking to their neighbors. And in their eyes, you could see how exhausted they were, how down they were. I happened to sit next to their platoon sergeant, a young man named Danny. Danny was their best English speaker, so he engaged me in conversation. And at one point, he pointed to me and the other volunteers in the mess hall and asked, "What are you people doing on our base?" And I explained that we were volunteers from around the world who'd come to Israel to show our support for the country by working on military bases. So he turned to his soldiers and translated that into Hebrew. And all of a sudden, these slumped over, exhausted soldiers perked up and began speaking to each other in very fast and excited Hebrew, which of course I don't understand. So I turned to Danny and I asked him, "What are they saying?" And Danny said, "They're saying, hearing this is sweeter than breathing the air. Hearing this is sweeter than breathing the air." That's how our presence impacted the morale of the Israeli soldiers. Now, it's very satisfying and rewarding to the volunteers to see how our presence boosts the morale of the soldiers. It's also very rewarding for the volunteers to receive expressions of appreciation from those soldiers that we work side by side with. So I'd like to share with you another story about a group of soldiers who expressed that appreciation in a very unusual way. Excuse me. About 5 years ago, I was assigned to an Air Force base near Tel Aviv. It was a logistics base, but a very unusual logistics base. And let me explain why. I think most of you know that Israel receives $3 billion in military aid every year from the US. Well, a good chunk of that $3 billion arrives in Israel in the form of aircraft parts. Why aircraft parts? Because the Israeli Air Force flies only US-made planes, and so is in constant need of replacement parts. So defense contractors all over America manufacture these parts, and that creates a lot of jobs for Americans. And then from all over America ships these parts to one spot in Israel, this base. So a tremendous volume of material gets shipped to this base, and then the base is responsible for shipping it out to various Air Force bases around Israel. So I arrived on this base as part of a team of 20 volunteers, both men and women, for a 3-week stint. And on our very first day there, the base made an announcement to the soldiers on the base. And the announcement said that the base was so far behind in its work, so far backlogged, that in week 2 of our time there, this is week 1, but in week 2 of our time there, the soldiers were going to have to work a 12-hour shift. After the announcement, the officers came to us volunteers and asked us, "In week 2, do you want to work a normal 8-hour shift? Or do you want to work 12 hours like the soldiers will have to?" And we said, that's not even a question. If we work side by side with the soldiers and they work 12 hours, then we work 12 hours. Okay, but that's Week 2 in the future. This is the beginning of week 1. Seeing how far behind this base was really motivated us to work as hard as we can to see if we can have an impact, to see if we can have a positive effect. So we worked really hard that first week, and it had an effect. At the end of the first week, the base made a second announcement to the soldiers on the base. And that second announcement said that due to the efforts of the volunteers, while we still have a backlog, it's been brought down to a level that we can now cancel the 12-hour workday in week 2. So the volunteers were happy, and the soldiers were very happy. Then we go into week 2, and 2 things are different now. Number 1, the volunteers have seen that we can have a positive impact on this base, and that super motivates us. And number 2, probably even more importantly, we, the volunteers, now know all the processes and procedures on this base. So we don't have to stop and ask soldiers where things go and what to do. We know where everything has to go. We could start working in the warehouses in the morning even before the soldiers show up. We don't even need them because we know what everything has to go. And in that week 2, we really dig into the work, and we're very effective and we're very productive because we know all processes and procedures. And again, it has an impact. At the end of week 2, we had helped the base completely eliminate its backlog to the point that they were dismissing the soldiers an hour early, 4 o'clock in the afternoon instead of 5. Now, these are commuter soldiers, so they live in the general Tel Aviv area, so they get to go home at night an hour earlier and see their families an extra hour in the evening. They also dismissed the volunteers an extra hour early, 4 o'clock in the afternoon instead of 5. So the volunteers were happy, and the soldiers were ecstatic. Now, it happens in those first 2 weeks that I became good friends with one of the soldiers I worked side by side with in my warehouse. His name was Josh, and what was unusual about Josh is he was the only Israeli soldier there who was originally an American. He had grown up in a small southern town in Georgia, USA, and when he graduated high school, he and his family made Aliyah, and he joined the Israeli Air Force. So I became good enough friends with Josh that I thought he would honestly answer my question that I threw at him, and this is the question I threw at him. I said, Josh, these soldiers are very nice and polite to us to our faces, but what do they really think about us behind our backs? What do they say about us behind our backs? And Josh was honest in answering my question. He answered it in 2 ways. The first was a comment, but basically I've heard from other soldiers about the volunteers on other bases. And Josh just blurted it out. He said, "We think you're all crazy." Remember, he's from southern Georgia. "We think you're all crazy," he said. "The soldiers don't understand why you would give up 3 weeks of your comfortable lives in America, kiss your families goodbye, pay good money to fly here, just to work hard and sweat on a military base. That makes no sense to them. They're here because they're obligated to be here, and they're here out of patriotic duty. But you folks aren't obligated to give up 3 weeks of your comfortable lives in America, so they don't understand why you're here, so they just call you all crazy." Then Josh hesitated for a second, and he said, "Well, there's something else the soldiers call you folks behind your backs. But before I tell you what it is, I need to give you a bit of explanation." He said, "You need to understand that this base is like the Amazon.com of the Israeli Air Force. A tremendous volume of material gets shipped into the front door every day and has to get shipped out every afternoon." And he said, "We're just not equipped to handle it. We don't have enough people. So we're constantly backlogged, we're constantly behind. Our officers are constantly pulling these 12-hour shifts on us, and we don't get to see our families very much, and the workload just gets us down. Then you 20 folks show up, all puffed up and ready to work hard, and you do. In fact, you help us completely eliminate our backlog on our base after only 2 weeks. And they're actually sending us home an hour early every day." He said, "Wow, that never happens on this base. That gives us an extra hour with our families, and that extra hour is precious to us. And so we have another name we call you folks behind your backs. We call you folks angels from God. Angels from God because you give us this extra precious hour with our families." So Josh said, "On the one hand, we call you crazy. On the other hand, we call you angels from God." He said, "Mark, if I were you, I would take that as a compliment." And so I did. And I made sure to spread the word to all the other volunteers at the end of the second week, what they were calling us behind our backs. So going into the third and final week, you can rest assured that we were super motivated to work as hard as we could to see if we could continue to have the soldiers go home an hour early. And you know what? They did. And the only question the soldiers had for us at the end of our time there was this: could you stay another week? We couldn't, but it was nice to know we were appreciated. Excuse me. So the volunteers are divided into groups by language. So there'll be an English-speaking team of volunteers, French-speaking team, Russian-speaking team, etc. And each volunteer team is put under the direction of an Israeli soldier, a Sar-El soldier, usually a young woman called a Sar-El madricha. These Sar-El madrichot are especially young women. They're very talented, very smart, very resourceful, and it's very competitive to become a Sar-El madricha. The volunteers tend to cherish their madricha because she takes such good care of them. And the army, in turn, tends to value these young women because they are so talented. So I'd like to share with you another story from my book that illustrates how much the army values these special women, these Sar-El madrichot. Every couple of years in Israel, budget permitting, like underline budget permitting, Sar-El holds an annual get-together, usually in the summertime, for an afternoon of all Sar-El volunteers that happen to be in Israel on that day, and all Sar-El madrichot, and a whole bunch of military dignitaries, over 1,000 people, and they bring them together and cram them into this big auditorium in Jerusalem. In the front of the auditorium is a giant stage with steps leading from the floor of the auditorium up to the stage. And this get-together is divided into two parts. The first part is what I call the pep rally. They're bringing the Army, Air Force, and Navy singing teams. These are teams of very talented young soldiers who sing Israeli songs for the audience and then lead the audience in singing Israeli songs. And in leading the audience in singing, the audience gets all revved up, it becomes emotional, people start dancing in the aisles. It's a lot of fun. It's what I call a pep rally. Then the second half of the get-together is a big thank you. It's a thank you to the volunteers for being there. And then there's a thank you to those Sar-El madrichot who are about to leave the army because they finished their military time. And at the very end of that second thank you, they call out the names of the top 10 Sar-El madrichot who are about to leave the army. It's sort of like a college graduation, and these are the top 10 honor students. And then they do a very nice thing for these top 10 young women. First, they invite their parents. Second, they line them up at the base of the stairs leading up to the stage, and they ask their parents to stand with their daughters, flanking them. And then one by one, the presiding officer on the stage calls up each soldier by herself, recites some of her finer qualities, hands her a special certificate, hands her a big, beautiful bouquet of flowers. That soldier walks back down the stairs to meet their parents, and at the base of the steps is waiting a military photographer to take a picture of that soldier in uniform with her flowers, with her certificate, flanked by her parents, and then the picture is given to the soldier as a keepsake, as a remembrance of this very special occasion. It's a very nice thing they do for these top 10 soldiers. So I was lucky enough one summer to be in Israel volunteering when they had this get-together. And I very much enjoyed the first half, the pep rally part, the singing and the dancing in the aisles. And then the second part was the thank you to the volunteers, the thank you to the Sar-El madrichot who were about to leave. And then they called out the names of these top 10 young women. And they lined up at the base of the stairs leading up to the stage. And I happened to notice that the 10th one in line, the last young woman, was standing by herself, no parents. And as opposed to the other 9 who were smiling and sort of acknowledging the special award they were about to get, the 10th young woman was not smiling. She looked kind of forlorn. She just stared down at her boots and looked a little sad. I happened to be sitting next to my own madricha, so I gave her a nudge and I said, "What's with the 10th one in line? Why is she standing by herself? And why does she look so sad?" My madricha told me that the 10th young woman in line was named Larissa. And Larissa was a lone soldier from Russia. Being a lone soldier means you've left your family behind in your native country and moved to Israel by yourself to join the army. And it's a very brave thing to do because it's hard to start a new life in a new country without the support of family nearby. And in the case of Larissa, her only family in the world was her mother, who had raised her back in Russia and whom she hadn't seen in 2.5 years since she left Russia. So my madricha suggested that perhaps Larissa was looking so sad because she was missing her mother. Everyone else had parents there and she had no one. So the presiding officer starts to call out the names of these 10 young women. One by one, they go up to the stage and return. And then finally he gets to the 10th one. He calls up Larissa. He recites some of her special qualities, hands her the certificate, hands her a big, beautiful bouquet of flowers, and then keeps her on the stage and announces to the audience of 1,000 people that Larissa is a lone soldier from Russia, and that's why she has no family with her. And so they've arranged a special treat for Larissa. And this is back in the days before cell phones were common. Cell phones were in their infancy, in fact. And he tells Larissa that they've arranged, especially with her mother back in Russia, to be available by phone so that she can congratulate her daughter for the special recognition. And then he whips out of his pocket what looks like a box. It's an early stage cell phone, big clunky thing. And he hands it to Larissa right in front of the microphone and says, here, you can speak to your mother. And Larissa takes the phone, and you can hear her say a few words in Russian to her mother and listen. And all of a sudden, she abruptly hands the phone back to the officer and says, I can't hear her. I cannot hear her. It's a bad connection. So then the officer says, well, then turn around. And from the darkness in the back of the stage, out walks Larissa's mother. The Army had secretly arranged to fly her in from Russia to be with her daughter on this special occasion. Larissa gave one shriek and ran to the back of the stage and started hugging her mother and crying and hugging and crying and hugging and crying and wouldn't stop. The presiding officer has this awkward moment on the stage, what to do. Finally, he drags the microphone back to the back of the stage and leans over Larissa and very gently says to her, would you like to say a few words? Larissa is still crying. She's too overcome to talk. So she just shakes her head, and all she can utter is spasiba, thank you in Russian. And then slowly, Larissa and her mother, still hugging and still crying, walked off the stage. And there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, especially amongst the Sar-El Madrichot. This shows you how much the Army values these special young women. Excuse me. That's a hard story to tell because I get emotional every time I tell it. It was an emotional scene to be there, and I can't help myself. Okay, I think we have time, if Carol and Bev allow me, for one more story before I wrap it up. And this story is about another madricha. Her name is Carla. And Carla was my madricha on that Air Force base I talked about earlier. Carla and her family made Aliyah from Argentina. And when they came from Argentina to Israel, they didn't arrive as part of a large group like Nefesh B'Nefesh sends 200 or 400 North American Jews to Israel at a time. They just arrived as their small nuclear family with no connections in Israel, no friends, no family. They didn't know a soul. And they felt very much alone and lonely in their strange new country. Carla went into the Army, and she dearly wanted to become a combat soldier. Now, you need to understand that Carla was ideally suited to be a combat soldier because Carla is a very large young woman. She's almost 6 foot tall. She's very broad-shouldered, very strong-looking. You might call her Zoftic. And she has short blonde hair, blue eyes, and a very pale complexion. She looks Scottish or Swedish, but big and strong. So when she went into the Army, she put up her hand and volunteered for combat training, and they took her for combat training. And she passed all the physical challenges with flying colors because she is a very large, strong young woman. Then she got to the very end of combat training and she flunked out through no fault of her own. It turned out that Carla was allergic to certain plants that are native to Israel that make her break out and sneeze uncontrollably. And you cannot have a combat soldier in a tense situation where everyone has to remain silent, breaking out and sneezing uncontrollably. So Carla could not become a combat soldier, and instead she chose to become a Sar-El Madricha. Now, in her training course to become a Sar-El Madricha, which lasts several weeks, she happened to run into another young woman, a trainee, named Hadar. Now, Carla and Hadar were the physical opposites of each other. Whereas Carla was almost 6 foot tall, big and strong, really built, and blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale complexion, looked Scottish or Swedish. Hadar was the opposite. Hadar was maybe 5 feet tall if she stood on her tiptoes. She was built like my pinky, I know because I met Hadar, and she looked like she came from an Arab country. She had straight jet black hair, dark eyes, very dark complexion. She looked like she was a Yemenite Jew. And these two dissimilar looking soldiers, when they met each other, just hit it off for some reason. The chemistry between them was such they immediately became best of friends and ended up spending all their free time together during their training course. To the point that Carla, at one point, jokingly, because they look so different, jokingly said to Hadar, you know, we spend so much time together that people are going to start to think we're related, especially because we share the same last name, Berger. Now, you need to understand that Berger is a very common last name in Israel. It's like Smith or Jones is here. Even I have relatives in Israel named Berger. So Hadar responded to this joking comment by saying, well, people might think we're related, but that can't be, because my grandpa Berger was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust from his small village in Poland. Carla responded by saying, well, that can't be on my end either, because my grandpa Berger was also the only member of his family to have survived the Holocaust from his small village in Poland. Then Carla asked Hadar, just out of curiosity, what was the name of your grandfather's village? And Hadar answered, Stuchov. Then Hadar threw the same question back at Carla. What was the name of your grandfather's village? And Carla answered, Stuchov. And then these two young women put two and two together and figured out that their grandfathers were actually brothers. And that meant that these two women, as dissimilar as they looked, were actually cousins. But more importantly, it meant that Carla's family, which had arrived in Israel from Argentina, knowing no one and feeling very much alone and lonely in their strange new country, actually had a very large family waiting for them in Israel. And so shortly after this conversation I just related to you, there was a very happy reunion of the two branches of the Berger family. It's a story with a happy ending. And speaking of endings, I think I need to wrap it up. Bev and Carol are giving me the hook. Again, the name of my book is A Passion for Israel, Adventures of a Sar-El Volunteer. It's available on Amazon. It's full of stories of the type I've just told you. It's meant to both entertain the reader and educate the reader. There's a lot of history of Israel in this book. It's meant to educate people about Israel. So I hope you read my book. I hope you enjoy my book. And it may just tempt you to volunteer. Thank you for your attention. I turn it back to Beverly and Carol.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was great.